In this video, we will talk about theories of dyslexia. First, a definition of dyslexia. Dyslexia is a persistent and unexpected difficulty in developing age-appropriate and experience-appropriate word reading skills. So reading skills at the word level, not the text level, not about comprehension. Theories of dyslexia are meant to and are supposed to explain why these difficulties, these persistent and unexpected difficulties occur, what they are related with, and how they lead to the observed patterns of performance in children who have the difficulties. For several decades, the dominant theories have been single cause theories. That means we're talking about theories that are trying to find the one cause of dyslexia. People have assumed that there is a cause that is the same for all children with dyslexia and have been searching for that one cause at various levels of generality. The dominant theory of dyslexia of this sort, indeed dominant to this date, and with a lot of supporting evidence for it, is the phonological deficit theory. This is the idea that dyslexia, so word level reading problems, are caused by a deficit in phonological processing. This deficit has been thought to affect phonological representation and phonological processes that lead to impaired learning of grapheme to phoneme mappings and therefore subsequently to orthographic learning. This is an attractive idea because we know that phonological awareness tasks are strongly related to reading development and strongly predictive of early learning to read. However, it should be noted that phonological awareness tasks concern a metalinguistic level and do not concern the level of phonological representation or processing that is used for linguistic communication. Indeed, there has been no consistent evidence for any deficit in processing of speech sounds, of lexical access, so perceiving words, or in phonological constraints in language use. Children with dyslexia perceive speech sounds appropriately, access the words that they hear, so perceive words appropriately, and produce words appropriately, and use the right structures in the way they produce sentences by applying the relevant phonological constraints for their language. There have been scattered reports of problems in these areas that concern sporadic group differences that have not been consistently replicated. Indeed, sometimes different studies have produced directly opposite results. The only consistent and very strongly supported finding is that there are difficulties in phonological awareness tasks associated with difficulty in learning to read, and even this doesn't account for every child with reading problems. Still, because of the weight of the evidence on phonological awareness, the phonological deficit theory for dyslexia remains dominant to this date. Another approach to explaining reading problems has been the so-called naming deficit. The naming deficit is supposed to concern rate problems, so problems in processing things with sufficiently high rate. And all we have about the so-called naming deficits is evidence for poor performance in serial naming tasks, the RAN tasks, that are associated with reading development, especially reading fluency and with reading difficulties. One problem with this idea is that the evidence for naming individual stimuli is not very strong. Indeed, the differences there are much smaller. So we don't see naming problems with individual stimuli. We see them sequentially with stimuli presented simultaneously in an array. Another difficulty with this idea is that there is no consistent evidence for any general speed problems. So if it's rate that has been indexed by the naming tasks, then why aren't rate problems obvious with other kinds of speeded tasks? This idea also runs into trouble when considering that there are children with reading difficulties who do not have any obvious deficits in rand-type tasks. In searching for single causes of dyslexia, many researchers have proposed a very wide range of ideas. Some of them concern auditory processing, so the way our hearing, our sound processing system works. This includes the rapid temporal processing hypothesis or the temporal sampling framework. Other researchers have proposed fundamental deficits in visual or attentional processing. And you may hear about the magnocellular theory of dyslexia, the visual attentional span hypothesis, the sluggish attention or cueing hypothesis, and a whole bunch of other ones. The idea behind all of these approaches was that there must be some core deficit, some elementary problem in how the brain processes stimuli that leads to subsequent problems in learning to read because of the way these more fundamental processing problems have derailed phonological processes or visual processes or both. So the idea behind these approaches was to try and explain the immediate reasons of the failure to read, which were thought to be phonological or visual or a combination of these two, and try to see what may be behind them. Moving beyond single cause ideas, there are a number of subtyping approaches or dual deficit theories. And in these theories, researchers have identified more than one possible causes and have therefore decided to group children with dyslexia into categories defined by their specific type of deficit. A very prominent idea is the distinction between surface and phonological dyslexia. This idea depends on specific theoretical assumptions made in the dual root cascaded model of skilled reading, which was made to account for performance observed in English-speaking patients with brain damage, because there were differences in performance with different kinds of reading tasks by those patients. Subsequently, that model was applied to children learning to read, even though it was only made for skilled reading and had no learning ability. So this kind of model doesn't learn to read by design. It has no developmental plausibility in the sense that there is nothing in the model that suggests how these two roots could be built up from experience. And the idea that there may be surface and phonological types of dyslexia in children are contradicted by actual evidence. There are no clear types of children who have the specific kinds of difficulties that are predicted by this kind of model. Most children who have reading problems have very similar kinds of problems with all kinds of reading stimuli and tasks, in contrast to predictions from the dual root theory that suggests that some children may have trouble with one of their roots and other children with the other one of the roots. This is not observed. So although this subtyping idea has been very attractive, most researchers have abandoned it because it doesn't agree with the empirical data. Another subtyping idea has been much more successful, at least on empirical grounds, and that concerns the so-called dual deficit that splits the causes of reading problems into naming and phonological deficits. This approach suggests that there are two kinds of reading problems, and the two kinds of reading problems are associated with two different non-reading tasks. One group of dyslexics, according to this idea, would be characterized by poor performance in RAN tasks, another group by poor performance on phonological awareness tasks. And of course, there would be a third group that might be characterized by poor performance on both tasks, and these would be most severely impaired. This theory has a lot of support for the observations among the two important tasks, RAN and phonological awareness and reading. However, it doesn't go beyond the tasks themselves into explaining how the problems occur. It doesn't have much explanatory potential beyond suggesting two areas for assessment and for the assessment of severity of the reading problems. What has emerged more recently is that the two kinds of tasks, RAN and phonological awareness, are typically differentially related to reading performance within participants rather than between them. So we've found that phonological awareness is strongly predictive of spelling and of the early development of reading accuracy, whereas RAN is strongly predictive of the development of reading fluency past the early stages. There are additional subtyping approaches that include visual attention and phonological deficit or other classifications of deficits. The reason that many researchers have moved from single cause theories and toward dual and subtyping theories is that everybody has appreciated that there is great heterogeneity. It has become clear that children with word level reading problems are very different in their performance profiles, both within the reading and spelling domain and outside in reading related tasks, tasks that are strongly associated with reading development. There is no uniform dyslexic profile on this set of tasks among children. So there have been different options about what to do with this heterogeneity from a theoretical point of view. The first option, and the older one, which still persists in some cases, is to basically ignore the heterogeneity. Assume that heterogeneity is caused by some sort of noise, whereas the true nature of dyslexia is indeed related to a single source. So single deficit theories of dyslexia purposefully ignore heterogeneity and purport to point to the true source of the problems. A second attitude toward heterogeneity is to admit it exists, but limit it to specific subgroups or subtypes. And this is the approach taken by subtyping dual and triple deficit theories. A third approach is to bite the bullet and realize that heterogeneity runs deep and wide and is not going to go away and is not going to fit into a limited number of boxes. To embrace heterogeneity really means to realize that children really do differ a lot in their profiles because they do differ a lot in the developmental trajectories that have led to their current performance. So what we need to do is to understand how a multitude of possible risk and protection factors may affect final reading outcomes. And so what we would have to study is these factors, their interactions, what outcomes they can lead to, and whether they're malleable, whether we can intervene, and what effects our intervention might have on the different factors that are either risk factors or protective factors for reading difficulty. Many existing theories of dyslexia suffer from problems with validity. Validity is the extent to which a measure or a theory concerns what you want it to concern. Particular validity problems with many theories of dyslexia can be seen in the conflation between tasks and constructs. It is very common for a dyslexia theory to be based on one task or a very small group of similar tasks. And instead of considering performance on this task as the outcome of a multitude of cognitive processes, instead conceive of this task as a pure measure of an underlying construct. So this is very obvious in an otherwise very successful approach, which has to do with serial naming and its undisputed relationship to reading fluency, in that proponents of the naming deficit only have poor performance in RAN as evidence for a so-called naming deficit. And indeed, some of them go so far as to say that RAN measures naming ability. So instead of seeing performance on a RAN task as a multiply determined behavioral outcome, they align this performance with a supposed ability. This is a very large validity problem. Another problem with many theories of dyslexia is that they ignore specificity. For example, if somebody says that a phonological deficit is the cause of dyslexia, this predicts that observed deficits should be specific to phonology. If someone says phonological awareness specifically is a problem causing dyslexia, then this means that only phonological awareness problems should be observed, and not, for example, morphological awareness problems. This is also true for many of the sensory approaches. If someone is proposing a visual processing deficit in dyslexia, then they are essentially ignoring any data that have to do with auditory processing, and so on. A very important validity problem concerns generality. Typically, theories of dyslexia examine groups and report average performance. But if we look at individual participants within that group, we will see a very large range of performance, including many individuals with dyslexia that do not actually have impaired performance in this task. So if someone says, for example, that poor auditory processing causes dyslexia, and they find in a task of their choice that children with dyslexia have on average somewhat lower performance than children without dyslexia, dismiss the fact that most of the children with dyslexia in their own study actually are not impaired in the task, and it's only the average that is lower. Therefore, the theory cannot serve as a general explanation for dyslexia. More generally, what is missing is a description of exactly how the purported cause will lead to the behaviorally observed reading problem. To illustrate this, I'm going to use the example of auditory theories, because there are several in the literature, and there actually was a logical connection that was made by the researchers. Researchers were hypothesizing quite reasonably that if there are any subtle deficits in the way that our brain processes sound in general, some kinds of subtle deficits might lead to distorted perception of speech sounds. If someone has a distorted perception of speech sounds, in particular certain classes of speech sounds, that would be expected to lead to distorted or weak phonological representations. Distorted or weak phonological representations would then be unable to support stable and strong graphophonemic mappings. So learning of the sounds of the letters and understanding and applying the alphabetic principle and subsequently orthographic learning on the basis of these would be weak or unstable or unreliable or all of these, which would lead to poor literacy outcomes. Now, this is a reasonable hypothesis. And what was offered in support of such hypotheses was an observed correlation between reading outcomes or language outcomes in other cases and some measure of auditory processing. So a correlation between these was offered as support for a theory of dyslexia that went like this. But if you want to have a theory like that, you actually need to support all the links in the chain. So if someone says that subtle auditory deficits lead to distorted speech perception, you need to document that speech perception is impaired in exactly the way that is predicted by the kind of deficit that you are positing. And then you need to show that the extent of distorted speech perception predicts the extent of phonological reliability or instability, and that this predicts literacy outcomes. Not only would you need to show all that, you will also need to show that this is both general and specific. What does this mean? Well, if you're positing a specific kind of auditory processing deficit, then every kind of auditory task that depends on this thing should lead to impaired performance. At the same time, every comparable kind of auditory task that doesn't depend on this thing should not lead to impaired performance. So this tests for specificity. If you claim that there is a subtle auditory deficit that prevents you from hearing very brief sounds, or that prevents you from dealing with sounds that occur in rapid succession, then every task that includes brief or rapidly successive sounds should lead to impaired performance. And every task that involves long sounds and sounds that are not in rapid succession should not lead in impaired performance. And likewise, the same logic should be applied at all levels. Most theories do not even bother to test these. For auditory theories, which have a very long history, some components of these have been tested and are known not to hold. For example, the specificity of the auditory deficits is very poor, and there are no consistent deficits at the speech level. And this general idea applies to every possible dyslexia theory. If you have a theory that's supposed to explain poor literacy outcomes, you need to specify every link in the chain, and then you need to collect evidence to support every link in the chain. None of the existing theories have come anywhere close to demonstrating something like that. Instead, the attention of many researchers is going away from single or even 2 or 3 cause models, and instead embracing heterogeneity and realizing that there are multiple possible contributing factors that interact in very complex ways. A relatively recent development is called the probabilistic intergenerational multiple deficit model. And the idea here is exactly that there are many factors that interact in complex ways, leading to the observed outcomes. So down here at the behavioral level, we see the markers of the disorder. This is where we would see, for example, poor reading performance. But we would also see other factors that are not impaired. We might see poor decoding or low fluency, but adequate vocabulary, and adequate language comprehension, for example. That would all be down here at the level of behavioral factors. These outcomes occur on the basis of cognitive processing, which is our psychological description of what the brain does. This is where various kinds of representation are processed by cognitive mechanisms. And this is, for example, where things like identification of letters and storage of orthographic forms and grapheme to phoneme mapping or larger chunk mapping and all those kinds of things would belong here. And some of these are going to be more efficient than others, and they would interact in leading to performance on tests seen as behavioral outcomes. These cognitive processes are in fact implemented by our brain, so our neural systems. And at the level of neural systems, there are protective and risk factors that have to do with the development of the brain itself. And the development of the brain is in part dependent on genetic factors. So the brain develops as the genetic program unfolds within a given environment. The brain is not genetically predetermined, but is very strongly constrained. And in the genes, there can also be individual or combinatory protective and risk factors. So at every level of a child's description, a child can be described at every level. And at every level, we can identify multiple relevant factors for the outcomes, some of which might be risk factors, might be tending to make things worse, and others might be protective factors. So might be tending to improve things or protect from a negative outcome. Where do all of these come from? Well, to a large extent, they are developmental trajectories. So the child is a system that develops. The brain develops as genes are expressed, cognitive processes develop in interaction with the environment, and so on. The genes and the environment come primarily from the parents. So parents' genes and parents' phenotypes, so essentially the behavior of the parents and the environment parents create because of their genes and their phenotypes, this is the child's environment, which is passed to the child along with the genes. So it's very difficult to separate these two things. And there are also environmental influences that are provided by other agents, not the parents. So children go to school or children have peers. There are some effects and interactions here, as the parents may choose the child's school or the child's friends or the neighborhood they live in, which influences both the school and the friends. And there are also interactions here when, for example, a child enjoys language activities, obviously, and that leads the parents to perform more language activities with the child. So there are circles here that may serve to increase or decrease certain kinds of activities and therefore also their effect on the development of the child. And there is a large amount of developmental variability taking place here. And so for any given child, whether or not the child will end up with a reading problem or not will depend on protective and risk factors on a specific combination that this child has of all the relevant factors at all the different levels of description. Although dyslexia itself is only defined down here. So there are no dyslexic cognitive processes, no dyslexic brains, and no dyslexic genes. But there is dyslexia in a child who is not sufficiently responding to reading instruction. This kind of model which is fairly recent in conceptual development, gives primary importance to the notion of developmental route. So the trajectory through which a child reaches its current and future behavioral outcomes. These individual routes of development result from the interaction of multiple factors. And individual is very important here. Different children have different routes of development which reflect the effects of all these relevant factors simultaneously. The effects at these levels and between the levels are bidirectional. So things influence each other, both vertically and horizontally. Some of these factors at each level are risk factors, some are protective factors, and it is the balance between these two that determines the final outcome. There are general factors that may influence many outcomes, and there are also specific factors that may influence only specific processes. There are interactions between genetic and environmental factors that make it very difficult to disentangle the contributions of the two. There are systematic effects, but there are also chance effects. There is noise in the developmental processes, and there are also chance effects that may have a large influence due to the interaction of other factors. And finally, the outcome in terms of behavioral disorders reflects the response of the whole system, so of the whole child, to the challenges of the environment. All of these factors act together, and when the child is exposed to reading instruction, which is a challenge for every child, how the system, how the whole system will respond to this challenge will eventually determine the outcome. And of course, the question here is, can we intervene? At which time point and at which level is it most efficient to intervene for a given child? The only way to begin to be able to understand and answer these kinds of questions is to go in and find out about these factors at all levels as much as possible. This is a very different approach from trying to find the cause of dyslexia. So, what should we expect of a modern theory of dyslexia? First of all, if it's a theory of dyslexia, it must account for dyslexia. This means every child who is dyslexic should be covered by the theory. Otherwise, it's not a theory of dyslexia. It's a theory of why some children don't learn to read. A theory of dyslexia must be consistent with a theory of reading. So our understanding of how skilled reading works should be consistent with our ideas of what is wrong when someone is not a skilled reader. These two must fit together. And this is very important. And it's actually quite constraining because we are increasingly better understanding skilled reading. Even more importantly, a theory of dyslexia must be consistent with reading development, because reading doesn't just emerge one day appearing functional. Literacy develops slowly on the basis of prerequisite skills, leading to building new skills, and eventually leading to one's ability to decode, which leads to then one's orthographic learning and eventually becoming fluent. So there is a long sequence of acquired skill that leads to a skilled reading outcome. And a theory of dyslexia must essentially be a theory of how this process is derailed and what happens when it is derailed. What can go wrong, where, how, and what the outcome is. It's not enough to posit a deficit somewhere, because this is an ongoing dynamical process. So even if there is something that is identifiably wrong, which I have not been able to find so far, but even if there were such a thing, then this would just derail this developmental process that would still continue as children continue to be exposed to all the relevant environmental stimuli. They continue to receive reading instruction, they continue to be exposed to their home environment, school environment, and all the other stimuli in social environment, and they continue to develop along a trajectory. And so at the end of this trajectory is a literacy outcome, which may be successful or unsuccessful. But a theory of dyslexia must be a theory that is very closely connected to a theory of how reading develops. The theory of dyslexia must also be very clearly indicative of where dyslexia is defined. The theory of dyslexia today must concern a distribution of reading skill, a wide range of performance in which we arbitrarily choose a cutoff level and define dyslexia to be anyone below that. This means that there is no discrete condition and therefore they cannot be a discrete cause. Dyslexia is no longer viewed as a discrete condition. It is well understood and accepted in the reading field that dyslexia concerns the low end of performance in the distribution of reading skill. And we arbitrarily choose some cutoff point and call dyslexic everyone below that. We could have chosen another cutoff point above or below that. So a theory of dyslexia must lead to a distribution of skill and not to a binary outcome. A theory of dyslexia, crucially, must embrace heterogeneity. So it must be able to account for all the differences in the range and extent of different tasks and performances that are observed in children with dyslexia. And for the fact that beyond the common ground, the common element of reading difficulty, there is essentially nothing that is consistently in common between children with dyslexia. And in practical terms, a theory of dyslexia must help us understand what goes wrong in each case of each child and provide means to address the problem. So indicate potential areas for intervention that might be relevant for this particular child.